Well, welcome to Chapter 13 of our march through the criminal law here in North Carolina at Wake Tech, of course. We are focusing on theft today. This lecture is going to be a little bit shorter, I hope, than some of the others. It may not quite clock in at an hour or so, maybe 40 minutes. We'll see. But this is about theft, or perhaps larceny is a better word for that, but we'll distinguish between those two. But again, this course is being taught here at Wake Technical Community College. My name is James Chapman, and let's go ahead and jump in and handle the chapter. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending when you're listening to this. Okay, so these are the different learning objectives. Again, not terribly important. It more for review of this course than anything else. So let's go to the general property concepts. So you can divide things up into categories. Almost everything can be divided into categories, like people who are left-handed and people who are right-handed. But, sometimes you say there's two types of something when in fact there's three, because there are obviously people who are ambidextrous who can write with both left or their right hands. So when I say that when we start talking about property that you can divide it into two types, obviously you can divide it into a lot more than two. It's a little bit more complex. But let's start with that in order to build a model that we all can understand. And when the law talks about property, generally the first division or categories that we enter into is dividing property between real property and personal property. Now, traditionally in the law, because remember the law develops in the medieval world, land is by far the most important thing. So real property, and you can kind of understand how we would use the term real being more important. Real property, the shorthand of that is real estates. So that can be the land you grow crops on, the castle you live in if we're back in medieval ages, or the hovel for most of us. Today, of course, it's going to be the house you live in, but it also could be the farm you owned or the factory that sits on the land that you own. This is all real property. Everything else is portable, movable, and we tend to call that personal property. Now, it is, of course, theoretically possible to steal real estate. Usually that's going to have to be done via a fraud in the transfer of the real estate or in some sort of adverse possession, which would be sitting upon it or staying on it, but that's pretty rare. So any property can be stolen. Most property that's stolen is going to be that personal property, okay? And it can be, and here's where we have another division, it can be either tangible or intangible personal property. So in this subcategory, what do we mean by those two terms? Well, tangible is something that you can see, you can taste, you can touch, and its value or its existence is exactly what your senses perceive. So a coin, a dollar bill is tangible property in some ways. Actually, skip that. A bar of gold is probably the best example, but a piece of furniture, a car, all of those are tangible. You can see, taste, and touch it. Now, sometimes you've got intangible objects. These are objects that have an existence. I mentioned a dollar bill, but let's instead use a certificate of stock. It has an existence, so you might have a piece of paper that says 100,000 shares of Microsoft Corporation. Well, the actual piece of paper just by itself is worth what? 1/100th of a penny, because it's a piece of paper. But it represents something else. So we call that intangible property. Property that represents something other than the piece of paper. So intangible property can be stolen. And in fact, most wealth today probably is intangible. It's the stock people own, the mutual funds they have, the value of things other than gold bars, say. We also have services. For example, you can buy insurance, you can buy electricity, and you're buying that service. You're not getting a tangible good. You can buy a garbage service that comes and picks up garbage at your house, or the water that gets delivered to you. All of those tend to be services. And sometimes also we have the purchase of labor. But that's so far down for us that we're not going to look at it too much. Now, in most situations, a thief, whether he is stealing real property or personal property, and if it's personal property, whether he's stealing tangible personal property or intangible personal property, or even if he's stealing labor, he can't give good title. Essentially, he never owns it. And what that means is if a thief comes and steals a painting, let's say, and then he goes to sell that to someone, and the person purchasing it doesn't know that it's stolen, but he buys it. And let's suppose this happens 50 years ago. So 20 years later, the person that had purchased the stolen painting sells it to someone else. And of course, he believes he has good title to it, and he sells it, and so on, till we get to today. And at this point, a person might have gone through 5 or 6 previous owners. He might believe he has good title. And the original owner shows back up and says, hey, that's the painting that was stolen from my property. Now, the law is going to say you got to give it to the original owner, because even if you're an innocent, a good faith purchaser, like all those people were, you don't get good title. It's like that childhood game you might have played, hot potato, where I don't know if most people play this, perhaps I'm dating myself, but it's where the person that is holding the it's a fictitious hot potato, the object last at the end of the song is out of the game. Well, what would happen with the stolen painting, the example I give is the current owner would go back to the previous owner and say, give me my money back for this painting, it was stolen. And then that one would go back and back and back until you got to the thief, or until you got to someone that was no one alive. If we're talking about stealing, if it's movable property, a person is guilty of theft if he takes or if he exercises unlawful control over movable property of another with the purpose to deprive him of the property. Now, you can also be guilty of theft if you transfer immovable property, and that's going to go back to real property very often, to another, or any interest thereof when you're not entitled to do it. So again, let's look at another slide here, real and personal property. Oops. Real property is generally real estate. It's also the structures that are attached to it. Ownership is represented by a deed or some sort of legal document. You can steal real property, or you can even illegally use it. Squatting is an example. The key here is who has legal title to the property. Now, personal property, as I said, can be divided into tangible and intangible. Tangible is the object itself, like a gold bar, and an intangible piece of property is like that Microsoft stock I just talked about. Personal property also can be attached to a person or not. Now, what do I mean by that? Because we're going to have a big subcategory of theft, which is robbery. If I steal your glasses off your face, if I steal the wallet out of your back pocket, that's a robbery, because I'm taking the personal property from your body, literally. And that usually is a more serious crime. So we've introduced crime. Let's talk about what crimes we're considering. So under the common law, there were lots and lots of different types of theft, and there still are. Excuse me. I don't know why it did that. It did it because we had a bit of a kerfuffle here. Hold on. Under the common law, there were lots of ways you could steal property. Now today, mostly what lawyers will use and jurisdictions will use, different states, is the term larceny. And it's really going to require three things: that you take the property, and in some states you have to physically carry it away, that it has to belong to someone else, that you're taking someone else's property. And then we've got the third thing, with the intent to deprive the person that had it, of ownership and or possession. Now, in all states, one of the ways in which we decide how bad the crime is we look at the value of the property stolen or how you got it. So grand larceny in many states, and that's just a general term, not one we use too much in North Carolina, is if the value exceeds a specific amount. So $1,000 would make it grand larceny, a more serious crime, perhaps a felony. If you steal property of lesser value, if I steal an ice cream cone, if I steal a pen, that is usually called petite larceny, is property of a lesser value. Most often we're looking at a misdemeanor there. Not always, but most often. Okay, so North Carolina, misdemeanor larceny is taking another's property if it's valued at under $1,000. Now, one of the questions can be, well, what is something worth? Suppose I stole your grandfather's watch. Now, it might be very, very precious to you, but it might just be a really common old, Timex watch that he bought in a drugstore. And you might say, well, I think it's worth $10,000. And the thief, who's arguing that this is a misdemeanor larceny, might say, it's only worth $100. That question's going to be up to the jury. It's a question of fact. Now, if the property is valued at over $1,000, then it's a felony larceny in North Carolina. And we also make it a felony larceny if you steal particular types of goods. One of the most important ones is if you steal a gun, even if the gun's value is under $1,000, it's still a felony larceny. We also have crimes for if you simply possess goods that are stolen, knowingly, or if you transfer goods that are stolen. We also theoretically have receiving stolen goods. All right, so the taking. A theft doesn't happen until, in some sense, you take the property. So, a pickpocket puts his hand into your pocket, right? He hasn't stolen it until he puts his hand on the wallet and starts to pull it out. While it's just in the hand, just in your pocket, it is at best an attempted larceny. You started to do this action, you haven't completed it. But once the guy's hand has the wallet and is pulling it out, now it's complete. Now, under the common law, you used to see the term carry away or carrying away very often. That would require, for example, in this pickpocket, for him to get it out of the pocket and start to leave. Most states pretty much, even if there's bits and pieces of it left in the case law, don't use that. Any movement, however slight, is going to be enough to meet the common law definition that you've taken it. One of the things we're going to look at is very often who has control of the property. So two examples here I give you are if you switch bag tags, so an airliner will deliver another's bags to you, that is a taking. That's sufficient. I mean, all you did was switch the tags. You didn't physically take the bag, but you got someone else to do it for you. That would be a taking. If you illegally transferred real estate, again, you're not taking the real estate, you're not carrying it away, but you produced a false deed. Okay, so in North Carolina, typically when you try or you do successfully exercise control over an object, you have taken it. And this can be as simple as picking it up. You even just moving it a short distance. Now remember that the thief never gets title. He has what is called void or no title. If the stolen good is later recovered, no matter how many intervening owners, remember I gave the example of that painting, the original owner can reclaim the property from a classic theft. And, that can be really important. During the Second World War, the Nazis stole a tremendous number of paintings and art objects from people in occupied Europe, from Jews and from countries they occupied like France and Russia. And of course, they got paid back a little bit by the Russians when they showed up. The Russians stole a good deal of German stuff. And it's very, once you establish, hey, this painting was stolen by the Nazis in 1942, and it was stolen from my grandfather, that I would have a right to that painting over even a museum that owned the painting at that instant. And it actually happened in North Carolina, in our North Carolina Museum of Art, where we had some paintings. This was, I believe, back in the 1990s. And it turned out that about 50 years previously, they had been stolen by the Nazis. The original owners were still alive. They showed up, and North Carolina had to turn them over to them, and then sued the people they bought them from to try to get their money back. So it does, of course, have to be the property of another. Now, property of another means anybody that is in lawful possession of it. So if someone leaves their property with someone else for safekeeping, so let's suppose I check my coat, I have a mink coat, say, or I leave something valuable for safekeeping, and it's being held by another party, the hat check girl, right? And a thief comes in and steals it. That's taking another's property. Okay, we're still there. Now, theoretically, you can steal your own property, but that's a pretty rare event. Obviously, people that are co-owners can steal from each other. And one thief can steal from another thief. You can steal avoidable title. So if a thief had stolen a watch, and then another thief saw the watch and stole it from that thief, they're both chargeable with theft, even though neither of them had the right to the property. All right, intent to steal can be important. Theft is a specific intent crime. You've got to show that the person taking the property intended to deprive the owner of its possession and use. So one of the things that means is if you accidentally take something belonging to someone else, it's not a crime. So, example. You're in a classroom and you have one of the latest iPhones and you forget it. You leave it on the desk. So you leave the room and you go, oh my God, I forgot my iPhone. You walk back into the room and right next to where you were sitting, just within arm's reach, you see an iPhone. And you instantaneously think, without turning it on for a second, there it is, you grab it and you run to your next class. You get to your next class, you go to put in your password or your identification or whatever you've got on it, and it turns out it's not your iPhone. It's somebody else. And obviously what might have happened is they took your phone and you took their phone. So at this instance, you're not guilty of theft because you didn't have the intent to steal it. But once you discover the mistake, you have to, at this point, make reasonable efforts to return it. And if you don't, if you're just going to try to keep it, then you're a thief. So you're going to have to try to find them. Now, in most states, you have to want to permanently deprive someone of their ownership, and that's going to be presumed. The only time I've seen this very much where intent becomes very central is, first of all, if someone is trying to defend that they indeed didn't intend to steal it, and that's pretty rare. But the second time, which is a little bit more common, is I defended a number of juvenile cases of what we would call joyriding, where someone took a car but didn't intend to steal the car, they were just going to use it. And that would be no intent to steal. It's still a crime, they just didn't intend to keep the car. All right, so it's very often critical to prove this intent to steal because it can make it a difference between a felony and a misdemeanor. And strangely enough, a lot of the time intent is simply proved by admission. Hey, did you take that? Yeah, I took it. Hey, we caught you with Bob's phone. Yeah, I never should have taken it. Well, you've just admitted the intent. You do have defenses like mistake, I took it, I didn't know it was mine, or abandonment. You're walking on the side of the road, you see a phone, it's covered in grime and dirt, you pick it up, That property, as far as you can tell, has been abandoned. You're not intending to take the owner's property away from it. You pick it up. All right, let's talk about a very, very common crime, shoplifting. And we'll look at North Carolina's specifically. But you can have the issue of the taking. Shoplifting statutes commonly describe it not as taking, but if you intend to appropriate merchandise or deprive the owner of its possession, because you're often not taking it. Shoplifting can be a little bit difficult. Like, okay, you're in the store, right? And you put a can of tomato soup in your cart. All right, so you're exercising control of it. You've taken it off the shelf. It's now in the cart. Have you completed the theft? Well, no, you're planning on paying when you're going up. But let's suppose you had no intent to pay. Well, at that instance, you could argue fairly that indeed you have committed the larceny. So one of the things we've done in North Carolina is we've kind of gotten rid of the intent aspect. So let's look at how we treat it in North Carolina. North Carolina has 3 ones that are pretty important. This is the one that 99 times out of 100 is charged, and that is concealment of goods. So what that means is if you're in a store, and let's suppose there's a counter and it's got watches on it, and you put your hand down and you cover one of the watches, and now you put it in your pocket, and the security sees you, and you start to exit the store. You haven't gotten to the cash register yet, but you're kind of walking away from that and pretty close to the door. At that point, security stops you, and your defense is, hey, I didn't leave the store yet. Doesn't matter. In North Carolina, you have concealed the goods. If you intentionally conceal goods, okay, you have committed the misdemeanor crime of what most people would consider shoplifting, but we just call it concealment of goods. Usually it's a class 2 misdemeanor. It also can be done if you change the price tags. You know, if something says $10 and you scratch out one of the zeros and try to get it for $1. Once you get it out of the store, let's suppose they don't catch you before you go past the register, we don't charge shoplifting anymore. We don't charge concealment of goods. We charge larceny of goods, which is that theft. And there, it's going to either be a petite or a misdemeanor larceny or a felony larceny, depending upon what you stole and what its value is. We also have organized retail theft, which was recently added in North Carolina because there was this kind of manufactured crisis about gangs of retail theft. It really turned out that, in fact, theft rates weren't going up that much, but that it kind of became a crisis that didn't really exist. But in North Carolina, we reacted to it, and this is very, very common for crimes where people perceive a problem and they act on it, very often without a strong basis in reality. All right. Shoplifting that isn't stealing. Most statutes list specific actions as shoplifting, and the ones that we have in North Carolina, concealing merchandise while in the store, or altering or changing price tags with the intent to later purchase it, moving goods from one container to another, or causing a cash register to record an incorrect price. Now, here's something interesting, and it's called merchant's privilege. A suspected shoplifter in a store can be stopped and questioned. And sometimes even outside the store, they can be stopped and their identity at least. The merchant and or his agent, security officer, if they have probable cause to believe someone is a shoplifter, they can stop them, they can hold them for brief periods, and if they can do it without a breach of the peace, they can search them. If you can't do it without a breach of the peace, the person's going to fight you. You can hold them until the cops get there if it's a reasonable time. And people will often say, you got no right to hold me. Well, under North Carolina doctrine called merchant's privilege, you do have a right to hold someone that you suspect of being a thief. But it's got to be a reasonable suspicion. It can't just be, well, he's under 16 and, all teenagers steal. That's not good enough. And it can't be something really ugly like, well, he's fill in the blank of some minority you don't like, or some gender or some race you don't like. I don't like albinos. I don't like people from New Guinea. I don't like people who are Jews. You just pick a group that you have an unlawful or bad prejudice against. Can't use that as your basis. So you got tag switching, you've got undercharging, which is under-ringing schemes. You've got storming, which is that mass shoplifting that you see. Very dramatic, but pretty rare. You've got till tapping. This is something that usually, it's more direct theft, where you distract the employee and you grab the money from an open register. And then you got boosting, which is you put them in very large quantities. They're stolen and they're placed in booster bags and then stolen by gangs, and very often huge discounts. All right, well, of course, one of the ways that modern society is different than other societies is we have credit cards. So credit card theft occurs when the credit card itself is stolen, and every state has statutes about this. So it can be a crime to get credit cards by fraud. And by the way, it doesn't matter if you used it. So if I file fraudulent information and I get a credit card, I say, yeah, deliver it to my house. My name's John Smith and it's Bill Doe. Or I need a $100,000 credit limit and I have no debt, but I'm drowning in debt. And I get a card issued to me. That is a crime. If a card is stolen by burglars or pickpockets, if it's retained by someone, if it's counterfeited. The credit card itself need not be stolen. If you even get the number, that can be enough. Each time you use the card, it is a new offense. Being in wrongful possession of it is a crime, even if you don't use it. Manufacturing such cards or creating false cards is a crime. Okay, so focusing again on North Carolina quickly, merchant's privilege here and/or false imprisonment. North Carolina General Statute 1472.1 is the recognition of what had been primarily case law about merchant's privilege. And it gives a merchant, someone who is selling goods of a kind, the right to detain someone on the premises or close to the premises, a person they suspect of theft. That detention has to be reasonable. You can't beat them into submission. You can't lock them in the back room for 8 hours. The detention has to be for a reasonable time. And if you're dealing with a minor, you got to contact their parents or who is ever in charge. If the merchant follows these rules, all right, they reasonably suspect, and they've got that basis, the detention was reasonable, the time was reasonable, they contacted people, they behaved well, they can't be charged with the crime of false imprisonment and or kidnapping. All right, check violations. The interesting thing is, at one point, checks were exceedingly common in the economy. Billions and billions of dollars worth of checks went through the Federal Reserve System every day. Now, it still goes through, but obviously one of the things that's happened with the rise of technology is we are seeing less physical checks, and we're seeing less checks overall. They are a big problem, though, because most checks that bounce, are the result of negligence or mistake or bad bookkeeping. But sometimes they're intentional. One of the things that can happen is forgery and uttering, which are two separate terms. Forgery is you're signing someone else's name, and uttering is you're passing the check. There have been check forging rings. There can be forgery of securities, which are stocks or bonds. All of these can be crimes. So the crime of uttering, which is one that many people don't understand. We kind of understand forgery. Okay, here's a check. It's a blank check I found. It's drawn in the account of Tom Smith, and I'm just going to sign his name without permission. That is forgery. You have placed a legal name on a legal document that isn't yours. Uttering, however, is a little different. Uttering is you take that check, which you know is worthless because he didn't sign it, and you take it to the bank and you cash it. That is uttering. You've forged it. That's the first crime. You've uttered it. You've passed it. It can be committed with a forged check or a bad check that's not forged if you know it's worthless. So you get a check that you know is worthless, has been forged, and you still try to pass it. That could be uttering. Let's talk about North Carolina and how we treat it. So North Carolina has the misdemeanor worthless check and the felony worthless check. And here we don't use the $1,000. We use a $2,000. If you write, which is really the forgery, a check knowing you have insufficient funds, okay, it's class 3 misdemeanor. Now, let's suppose you thought you had $2,000 in there, but there was some automatic draft that was unusual and you only had $1,000 and you wrote a $2,000 check. Is it a crime? No, it isn't, if it's reasonable. But if it's not reasonable, if you say, well, I was going to hit the lottery, that's why I wrote a $100,000 check, and I was just counting on winning the lottery tonight. Well, that's crazy. Felony worthless check, class I felony, which is one of the more minor felonies, but still we're looking at real time here. If the amount of the check is over $2,000 in North Carolina, it becomes a felony. The forgery itself is related to any written instrument. So I've been talking about checks quite a bit, but it could be things like stocks, government bonds, anything. What it is essentially is a lie about the written document. So it can happen if you create a fake document. So you get a blank check and you sign John Doe's name, or you complete it. So you find a check that's been signed by John Doe, and you just write $100 on it. That's a forgery still, because he didn't intend it. If you endorse it in another person's name, and that changes it into what we call bearer instruments, which you can cash, or if you alter it. So the classic example there is you take a check written for $10 and you add a zero on, and now it's a $100 check. And then finally it becomes complete when you utter it, when you present it for payment. We do have some specific North Carolina laws. North Carolina General Statute 14119, which covers a lot of these FIs, financial instruments. It's the forgery of notes, checks, and other securities. Now, security is just that general term for intangible personal property, stocks, bonds. It's a crime to possess such things. It's a crime to create such things. It's a crime to retain such things. So all of those become crimes under North Carolina law. Here's a term that you don't see a lot, and we're going to look at it specifically in North Carolina. This is check kiting. These work, and they worked better in the past before we had computers that did things nearly instantaneously. And what you do is you establish a account at one bank, and they write a large check on that bank that's deposited into a second bank. And while it's going through the clearing process, the second bank where you put the $10,000 that you don't have in, you take withdrawals out of that. As I said, this used to be more common when there was longer periods of time between the establishing of checks and when checks went through. But really, thanks to Fedwire and a number of things, a lot of banking is near instantaneous. Even when they say it's pending, very often it's nearly instantaneous. And banks have security and methodologies to prevent it. Okay, so we'll conclude just talking about how North Carolina treats this. This is check kiting in North Carolina. The statute is 14-107. And the big thing here, we don't quite look at moving it around, is worthless check. If you have insufficient funds in your account and you know you don't have the money, it is a criminal act. Now, this one is this last thing, and I think it's an appropriate thing to end on because it's something that many of us have experienced, and that is giving someone a post-dated check. So in other words, someone says, well, give me a check for $1,000. And you say, well, I don't have $1,000 in my account. And the guy says, well, when are you going to have $1,000 in your account? And you say, well, I'm going to get it on Friday. And it's Monday. And the guy says, okay, write me a check, date it for Friday, and I'll hold on to it. That's a post-dated check. Now, under the law, in theory, and I want to emphasize this in theory, he's not supposed to cash that check till the date that the check is written. But in practice, it's perfectly okay for him to immediately deposit it. And obviously that could create a problem. Do we have a crime here? So this is really, really messy. In theory, it is a crime to ask for a post-dated check. To say, okay, give me a check now. I know you don't have the money. Give me a check that I won't cash till Friday. That, in theory, can be a crime. It can be a crime if you write a post-dated check. If you say, okay, I will write the check to you. Or if you don't tell the person. So in other words, I don't have $1,000 in my account. I write a check, okay, that is post-dated, or doesn't even have to be post-dated, and I give it to you. If it's not post-dated, it's worthless check right away. But if I know I'm supposed to get money in the future in the account, it could be worthless check under 14107. And so we really, really, really don't want post-dated checks. Again, this is something that is dying out because people aren't writing checks anymore. People are using credit. And they're doing all sorts of things that we really need a whole series of new laws for, like transferring money with Zelle or, with PayPal or something. So what we've had to do is we've had to create a whole new body of law to deal with this. And mostly what the law does, and this is very common, is that we take these old patterns. We say, okay, well, how do we make fraudulent payments by credit card a crime? Or how do we make fraudulent electronic payments a crime? Well, because we have a body of law about checks, general legislatures will go back to checks. They'll go back to statutes like 14107, and they'll say, well, let's use this as the template. Let's use this as the basis of the crime. And then they will update it, although they won't call it worthless check. They will call it worthless electronic transfer. So many, many states have done that. North Carolina has done it a little bit in piecemeal. We have a number of charges about electronic transfer, and it's only going to become more common. I have no idea what the future financial system of the United States is going to look like, except that it's going to be different than what it is today. Having said that, you're going to need a legal environment within which this system can function, and that's going to require new laws. And those new laws are going to be patterned after the old laws. And the reason for that is the old laws will really deal with most of these problems and can be modified. It's very dangerous to create whole new laws because sometimes you can do things with them, or sometimes they can be applied in ways that nobody ever thought of. And it can create a whole series of other issues. All right, well, on that kind of apocryphal warning, I guess, we'll close it here. As I said, this is going to come in right around at 40 minutes as opposed to our usual hour or so for each lecture. So a little bit shorter, although a very common area of the law. When you're ready, we'll move on to chapter 14. And until then, I hope you have a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or have a happy weekend if it's a Friday for you and you're looking forward to some relaxation. I will talk to you later.